Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the International Development Studies program at the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you all to the first speaking event in our International Development Studies Speaker Series 2013-2014. The year is still shocking, 2013-2014. Today, we have our esteemed director, Dr. Sally Humphries, the director of the International Development Studies program at the University of Guelph, talking today with us about efforts to evaluate farmer participatory research in Honduras. For those of you who do not know, Sally Humphries came to the University of Guelph in 1994, and with an interdisciplinary background and a PhD in sociology, she proceeded to study in Colombia and proceeded here at the University of Guelph over the past 20 years to develop research connections in Honduras. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sally to introduce her team. Thank you very much, Sally.
Thank you very much, Adam. Well, I'd like to introduce Lauren Klassen. And anybody who was observant will have noticed that when we first sent the first notice out, she was a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto. And on the second time we sent it out, she'd got a doctorate from the University of Toronto. So Lauren did her master's in anthropology and international development here between 2001 2003. And she worked in Honduras for her master's, and then we got funding from the Kellogg Foundation through the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, and Lauren went on and did more work following her master's to evaluate the program in Honduras, and that's what she's going to talk about today. And Sebastian Daly, Kindsvater, is currently a student in Fair and International Development Studies, and he's been working in Honduras this summer to do a cost-benefit analysis of participatory plant breeding. And so I'm just going to introduce the work so you have a background on what it is that's being evaluated. And then Lauren will talk at length about the program and its evaluation. And Sebastian will talk about the work that's ongoing and what he did in Honduras this summer. So, why is it not moving? I need some technical support here.
I'm not sure that I'm the best person to provide that.
It just won't move.
Did you try down arrow?
Yeah. It's just not moving at all.
Okay. There we go.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, so I've introduced their work, and then after both of them have spoken, I'll talk very briefly about the lessons we learned through this process. So just a little bit of background on Honduras. I think very few people are familiar with Honduras. It's a small country with a population of 8.4 million. 64% of the population lives below the poverty line. And 69% of the poor reside in rural areas. And I should say it's one of the most rural countries in Latin America. In other words, the population is about 50% of the population is still living in the rural areas. And 30% of the population lives on just $2 a day. Now, from the map, you can see the red zones are the areas where most of the poverty is concentrated. And most of those areas also represent upland areas. The research in agriculture that has taken place in Honduras has taken place in the lowlands and the foothills. There's been almost no research at all that has focused on the upland areas. So most of the poor people who are situated on the poorest soils in the upland areas have had no research to support them. Our program supports research in those upland areas. So before I came to Guelph, I worked for the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. I was sent to Honduras to develop a program in farmer participatory research. And it's the people that I met during that time while I was in Honduras, who are the same people that work with me today, 20 years later. And in the process of time, we formed an NGO. It's a research NGO in Honduras, and it's become quite well known. And it was funded initially by IDRC through the University of Guelph. And since 2000, it's been funded by USC Canada with CEDA funding. So the research, as I said, supports farmers in upland areas. And you can kind of see from the lower map that most of the locations actually embrace the red zones in the upper map there. So the way the program works is to train farmers to carry out research. And the research units are known as CIALs, which is a Spanish acronym, which means Local Agricultural Research Committees in English. So today, the NGO, which is called FIPA, which stands for the Foundation for Participatory Research with Honduran Farmers, works with 108 farmer research teams, and there are about 1,100 people organized in adult and youth groups who are conducting research. And you can see the kinds of trials that the CIALs set up. Women comprise about 44% of CIAL members. And I should say that this is quite a feat, because in Honduras, very few women take part in agriculture. So the fact that there are 44% of the CIAL members are women is substantial. And what the CIALs do is they learn to plan experiments, they set up randomized trials, they learn to evaluate the results, and then they share the results with other members of their communities. Now, when we started in the 90s, we weren't really sure what we were looking at, but we quickly found that one of the most severe problems was the fact that farmers in the uplands confronted a hungry period from about June every year, and it's known as Los Junios. Anita Baudet, for her research, introduced us to the idea of Los Junios. And so Los Junios start in June and last until the harvest in about September to October. So this was, all the farmers identified this as the main problem. And so the research that the farmers elected to do was to experiment in their primary crops, which are maize and beans, to try and eliminate this hungry period, Los Junios. And what we did, you can see a farmer's trial set up there. Initially what we did was we compared the farmers' varieties that they were using against what the scientists were using. We thought that the solution would lie in finding better varieties out there, but we quickly found that because all the research had been directed towards the lowlands, that the scientist-improved materials did not meet the needs of these upland farmers. And so we moved from an approach of looking for, scientist-led solutions to participatory plant breeding, because the local materials were better adapted to these upland areas, although they were still low yielding and susceptible to certain diseases. But this was the better option. So this is what we've been doing since about 2000. Added to that, climate change is a severe problem in Central America. I think Honduras is ranked as one of the most second vulnerable country to climate change in the world. I don't know how reliable this measure is, but it is. And one of the things that participatory plant breeding tries to do is to broaden genetic bases so that farmers have more options given climate change. So a lot of the work is indeed focused on broadening those bases. And since about 2000, with this PPB research, FIPA and the CIALs have released 7 bean varieties and 4 maize varieties, both at the national and the local level. The varieties released at the national level have been with the government. It's a FIPA government release. I mean, they've got a standing now in Honduras that they're recognized. And the yields, these are approximate increases, about 50% for beans and 30% for maize. These are really based on comparison with the local check in each experiment. So, I mean, these are kind of approximations, but there have been substantial improvements. So what Lauren is going to talk about first is the evaluation of the participatory research aspect, and then afterwards Sebastian will talk about evaluating, doing cost-benefit analysis of the PPB part of our research. Thanks,
Great.
Lauren.
Thank you, Sally. So, like Sally said, I'm going to be presenting on this really amazing master's research experience that I had, that I was really lucky to be involved in, evaluating certain aspects of this project. So, our evaluation responds to several shortcomings in the literature. For one, participatory approaches have proliferated without solid proof that collective action through community-driven development actually delivers benefits to the poor. So a World Bank study argues that there's no proof of positive impact of participatory research. This is in part because the community and the poor are celebrated as homogenous. Without power inequalities, and elite domination or capture of project benefits is common, but often unrecognized or shielded by the participatory rhetoric. Secondly, the literature is limited on appropriate approaches and tools for the measurement of unanticipated and gender results of participatory projects. Contemporary research using results-based management relies on log frames that look like this, or performance measurement frameworks, in which desired outputs or impacts and indicators are predetermined at the outset of the project and rarely revisited. And thirdly, we have limited knowledge of the impacts of women's participation, in large part because we have few tools for measuring these kinds of gender-related change. For example, Ashby and colleagues in their research in Columbia have shown that women's participation in agricultural projects helps improve productivity, but we know very little about what their participation does outside the spaces of the project and how it affects their relationships at home, for instance. This is due in part to a trend we see towards what Marilyn Strathern has referred to as audit culture. This is the ways in which accountability frameworks that are rooted in financial institutions are now being taken up in public institutions, and in particular in development projects. So one outcome of this is the complex process of gender empowerment is increasingly subverted in favor of measurable outcomes that are very easy to capture and easy to prove to your donors. So if you take a look at this photo, you can see that there are 6 women and 3 men in the field. This, according to way too many impact reports, constitutes gender equality. Thus, the objective of our impact assessment was to understand the social, including the gender-related, physical, financial, natural, and human livelihood changes experienced by the participants of this project, the CL participants, and their communities, and especially those reaching the poor, to gain insight into how this occurred. We're concerned with making sure that there was a fit between the evaluation that we were conducting and the participatory approach of the project. And so we wanted to make sure that we were using some participatory methods. But simultaneously, we wanted to make sure that our results spoke to our donors, the project staff who are continuously trying to improve the program, as well as the participants themselves. And to do that, we used a mixed method approach. So I'll explain, it consisted of 5 stages, and I'll explain each in turn here, and the results generated from each approach that we took, to make the point that mixed method approaches, this mixed methods approach was essential to our accurate understanding of how the impact occurred in this context. So I'll start with indicator identification. Excuse me. So first we did 40 semi-structured interviews to identify key themes of change that were identified by various participants. We then posted these themes up during 7 focus groups in different participating communities. As shown in the middle photo, this one's shown in the middle photo. And we asked the group to brainstorm all the changes that they could think of in their lives with respect to the project based on these themes that emerged in the initial interviews. And as you can see in that photo also, we tried to explain the concept of indicators by using different pictures of a weak maize crop and a healthy maize crop, a sick or a weak, unhappy child and a healthy child, and asked people to think about what indicated health in this context. And this sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. And then we also used an active learning tool called Think, Pair, Share to try and engage all the participants in the exercise. Think, Pair, Share actually helped us to elicit ideas from shy or less powerful group members by asking individuals to think on their own about the changes in their lives for a few moments, partner up with one or two more people and think about them as a group, and then share them to the large group as a whole. And so this meant that shy members didn't have to identify which changes they had contributed to the smaller group once we hit the larger group, or to us when we were the facilitators of the process. And the process actually enabled the elicitation of several different negative changes as well. It's an important benefit. So the results of this particular method were that we generated numbers of lists of changes in particular. Changes in social relations, changes in food security, changes in energy, happiness, confidence, income, hours of off-farm labor, etc. And then these changes listed by the participants were sometimes directly translated into indicators. For example, when participants said things like, we have fewer hungry weeks each year, we could simply translate this into a survey question that asked about the number of hungry weeks in the previous year. And when people said we perform less off-farm labor, we could easily, this actually taught us about an indicator, a wealth indicator that we perhaps wouldn't have thought of. But when people said things like, the children are healthier, or we have better relations in the house, the translation to indicators was less obvious. After compiling this list of changes and indicators elicited from these focus groups, we then had to go back to the literature and back to the participants in a number of interviews to try and understand how we can capture this in a survey. We were particularly surprised at all the gender-related changes that emerged from this stage of the evaluation. These signaled really big changes for women as a result of participation with the project. But this project wasn't a gender empowerment project per se. So this is part of the reason that this was a surprise as a result. We anticipated more results related to food insecurity and to increases in yield, less related to women's empowerment. And we also learned at this stage that women and men value different project benefits. The most important changes for women by far were their social changes in relationships with people, ability to work outside the house, changes in personal self-confidence or others' confidence in their abilities. For men, the most important changes were agricultural, their knowledge of fertilizer applications, learning to recognize diseases in insects, etc. Then we took those indicators that we discovered and we developed and integrated them into a survey. So the survey was administered by local students to over 300 participants in 3 groups of people. Those who had participated in the project for at least 5 years, those who were in the CL communities but were not participating in the project, and 2 communities that were not participating at all, counterfactual or control communities. And the data was analyzed using SPSS. Here's the results from the survey. Key results included the finding that participatory research can be pro-poor. We were able to draw on very limited database from 1997. We had a little bit of baseline data from that time to make some comparisons with our 2004 study. In 1997, the CLs were susceptible to elite capture. They were dominated by typical joiners, or what Cornwell calls the usual suspects, principally wealthy men. And by 2004, the wealthy farmers had left. If you take a look at this chart, the gray lines represent 1997, and the blue, tealy green, are the 2004 results. You can just see that in 2004, the farmers had far fewer assets, lower assets than in 1997. The other thing that's interesting about this chart is it tells us that if you look at the results that are non-significant, you can see that total land area and cultivated land area didn't come up as statistically significant. And they look different because there are some outliers in the 1997 data, but they aren't significantly different. So what we learned from this was that, in fact, total land area and cultivated land area, 2 of the most common wealth indicators in these kinds of contexts, weren't valuable in this context. The most important wealth indicators in this context were areas planted to cash crops, such as coffee, poultry, pack animals, and cattle ownership, as well as, and most importantly, institutional linkages. So those people who are well connected, have access to markets, they can grow more cash crops. Those are the people who were the typical joiners initially. So from here forward, instead of using the term pro-poor, we actually advocate the use of most marginal, just as a reminder of the fact that these are not typically, we're not thinking about sort of the measures that we would typically measure the poor. We're using other indicators to think about who are the least powerful in these communities. The second question we sought to answer asked what the effects of participation was on the well-being of these most marginal. If in fact these were the people who were participating, how did the project affect their lives? Now this is a very small sample of the findings that we have, and if you're interested in the end in seeing the numbers associated with these or how we came to these results, other results, etc., we published them in a couple of articles in World Development, and we can share them with you. But what I'll share now is that in 2004 survey, we found that CL members had gained significantly more poultry, pigs, pack animals, were more likely to have savings, and were more likely to have savings, and these results were reflected in their food security, as well as in their organizational linkages, etc. So we found that, in fact, CL members had more of all of these things. With regards to women's empowerment, the survey showed that women, in particular, have increased social networks since joining the CL. So if you see on the far column on this chart, most of the women said that they did not belong to any organizations prior to being part of the CL. After 5 years of participation with the CL, they had nearly 4 times that number of linkages, like formal membership in different kinds of organizations. Furthermore, we learned that women participants were more engaged in decision-making regarding growth and sale of agricultural products, joining local organizations, and managing household finances. And some women have gained more libertad, which is a local idiom used to describe freedom from husband's authority to engage in certain activities in this context. This is an indicator that we came to learn about in the indicator identification stage and ended up incorporating into the survey. 2 aspects of this result, however, were somewhat surprising or even perplexing to us. We had asked women what level of libertad they felt themselves to engage in various activities. These and others listed on the slide. These are the ones that were significantly different. We found that many CL participants and non said they had mucho libertad to engage in several activities, so a lot of liberty from their husbands. But CL participants recognized themselves to have gained that liberty since joining the CL project. This in turn affirmed our previous findings that the CL project actually targets the most marginal women in these villages. Their lack of liberty in the first place may have provided incentive for them to join, opportunity to get out of the house. Interestingly, however, we found that while non-participating women also had liberty, they don't use it. In other words, they frequently said that they had liberty to make decisions about household finances or to participate with local organizations, but they don't seem to take it up to engage in those activities. And I'll come back to this result in a few slides. Following the survey and the analysis of those results, statistical analysis of those results, we went back to the villages to facilitate a participatory analysis of the same results. This is perhaps the most important stage of our evaluative process. We conducted 10 focus groups, or workshops really, to which all the CL communities in the region were invited. And we explained, using charts, photographs, etc., the results of the survey and gave people lots of time to think about them, discuss them, and refute them. This is where we learned not what changes had occurred, nor to what extent, how many people had experienced these kinds of change, as we learned in the survey, but we learned how and why those changes occurred. Without this stage, we would have undoubtedly made several false assumptions and drawn inaccurate conclusions from the survey data. And I'll give a couple of examples of what we learned in these meetings now. So with regards to the data about CL members owning more pack animals than non-members, for instance, we assumed that the purchase of pack animals, after analyzing the survey data, and reflected an increase in disposable income. And that disposable income reflected an increase in yields. Participants explained, however, that live grass barriers in their fields that they planted as a soil conservation technique, learned through the CL, provided enough food to sustain 1 pack animal, and therefore they could afford to own 1 more pack animal than counterparts who were not participating, whereas previously they didn't. So actually their response reflected less the amount of income that they had to purchase the animal than a sort of long-term solution for sustaining the animal, a way to feed them. Similarly, with regards to our survey results showing higher levels of pig ownership and savings among participants, participants surprised us by explaining that this reflected a new consciousness among CL members, more so than greatly increased wealth, as one participant elaborated. We want to save and have money in the future. We want to invest in things like animals. And for this reason, we've begun to purchase more chickens and pigs, and we can use them to eat or to sell or to buy food, medicine, or pay for school supplies for children. Before the CL, we did not think this way. Finally, we also gathered a number of project histories, kind of like life histories, asking people who were participants of the project to talk about their history with the program. And we gathered interviews or surveys of male partners. And these were two qualitative methods that were specifically important to understanding some of the gender results captured in the survey. So 31 project histories were gathered and 20 surveys were done with different male participants. And the results were analyzed using in vivo qualitative analysis software. These added to the already rich qualitative data that we were gathering on the survey results. We learned from this data in particular that the change in CL membership to include and then benefit the most marginal, in particular women, was both purposive on the part of the NGO as well as more circumstantial in nature. We identified 6 main intersecting factors contributing to opening up participatory spaces for the most marginal and for benefiting women. In other words, we were able to explain how the impact occurred. The first is what we've called an ethic of inclusivity. Promoting inclusivity or creating an open access space was a primary objective of this project, and it was reflected in project philosophies and activities. For example, the project eliminated elected membership. This is how it was originally designed. And a chain of project facilitators was set up to encourage people to join as non-elected members. Women were especially encouraged to participate and made to feel very valued through various techniques that we can discuss at the end if there's time. This required extensive outside intervention and long-term capacity building on the part of the project. As you notice, this project has been ongoing for a very long time, since 1993. After time, the wealthy farmers left, realizing that the project involved a whole lot of work and not a lot of handouts, and the most marginal farmers remained. Building the skills of women in particular led to increased confidence. Recall that the women who were not participating frequently indicated that they had lots of liberty to engage in activities, like major decision-making in the household. But they didn't often seem to use it to actually engage in those activities. We learned through this qualitative research that non-participating women in the community were often much more critical of women who left the house to work in the fields with the husbands than men were, actually. Or in other words, gender inequality is perpetuated by both men and women. So by working on capacity building, the project increased the skills of women significantly, increased their self-confidence as well as others' confidence in their ability, and enabled them to participate and benefit. Thirdly, excellent facilitation skills of project organizers encourage those with low self-esteem to trust in themselves. Facilitators have to believe in participation as a philosophy, not a method, as participants frequently told us. One participant explained, perhaps it's not the methodology or the path that's worth fighting for, but instead the CL project makes people feel valued. And when people feel valued, they defend their rights. However, when a person feels devalued, anything said makes that person feel instantly humiliated. Fourth factor was that the broadened scope of the research to include development. For instance, critical to the success of reducing the severity of the hungry season were CL activities such as learning or teaching others to calculate how much grain a family consumes annually and to store enough for the hungry season so that families didn't have to resort to purchasing grains at a higher price during that season. Access to group credit for collective and individual production plots, so not only research but also production plots, helped to break dependence on local money lenders. Additionally, CL members were active in seed bank development, post-harvest storage, sewing and cookery classes, biodiversity competitions, seed fairs, visits and exchanges, dissemination meetings, etc. So the support that members receive outside of this research in all of these other activities helps to build group identity and offset some of the opportunity costs associated with participatory research, particularly long-term research, such as participatory plant breeding that Sebastian will speak about in a few minutes. Those ones take a long time to generate results. The fifth factor is the project's emphasis on social capital development. This enabled participants to resist ridicule by others in the communities for running experiments on tiny plots of land, rather than concentrating on large plots of land and growing food or cash crops. And this was especially important for women, who explained one has more friendships, a sisterhood. Now one can even be open and trust people, whereas before one could not even talk. Now we have all this big love and trust for one another, like telling each other our problems. And importantly, there's been some really interesting research in Latin America that shows that Honduras is one of the most machista countries in Latin America. It adheres to some of the most traditional masculine roles, and so this was actually a huge change for women. Many women don't work outside of the house at all and have a hard time leaving the house. Finally, and again, especially important for women's empowerment, was the way in which the project focused on agricultural research specifically. So this enabled a kind of gender-neutral spaces for learning. Women were not seeking integration into a recognized male activity, such as agriculture, but rather into research specifically, an area yet to be identified clearly as either men or women, or men or women's work. Women explained in long narratives the benefits of the research plots being closer to home, the traditional domain of women's work. The plots were also tiny, requiring meticulous work, very different from traditional agricultural practices of men. And this gave both men and women the opportunity to challenge traditional gender roles in a relatively safe or neutral space. Thus, the mixed method approach allowed us to understand the complex and unanticipated ways in which participatory research can benefit the most marginal, and open spaces for challenging some gender inequalities. Sebastian and Sally are thus going to use a very similar approach to their current work in understanding the cost and benefits of engaging farmers in PPB. And I'm going to turn the stage over to Sebastian now to explain a little bit about his plans, and then Sally will join us again to talk about the lessons learned from this research.
Thanks, Lauren. That was not an issue in Honduras. I blended in with no problem there, so that was really nice. I've just returned from Honduras about 20 days ago, and my research question was basically to find out what have been the quantifiable costs and benefits of participatory plant breeding. I've included this photo here to give you an idea of basically what the farmers are doing. So they're planting different varieties of beans, and this is maize. They're harvesting them, and they're laying them out like this, basically so they can find out which ones they like best. So whatever ones they like best, they'll pass on to the next phase, and so on and so forth, until at the end they're hopefully left with an improved variety that's better for their own local uses. Proponents of PPB in the literature basically assume that participatory plant breeding is an effective way to generate new genetic materials. But this really depends on whether those materials are being adopted by farmers and whether the process by which these materials are being produced is actually cost effective. In this case, relative to the alternative, which is conventional plant breeding. When we're talking about conventional plant breeding and participatory plant breeding, conventional refers to scientists in a laboratory producing new varieties, and participatory research refers to farmers in their own fields doing the same kind of research. So there's been little research done basically to compare the cost between these two methods of producing new varieties. And so the results of our research will hopefully contribute to the discussion surrounding these assumptions. What has been done is a 2011 MSU, so Michigan State University thesis by a student named Byron Reyes, where he compares the cost of participatory plant breeding to conventional plant breeding. He makes an assumption basically that PPB costs can be calculated simply as a percentage of the cost of conventional plant breeding. His justification for this assumption, and this is a quote from his thesis, without getting too catty about the whole thing, but this was done because there were no records of PPB costs. So in the end, he finds that the cost to produce a new bean variety via PPB is 20% of the cost to do so, produce the same variety under conventional methods. We feel this needs some more exploration, and so our research aimed, among other things, to identify and document the costs of PPB in more detail. Also, to test the finding that Reyes found, which is that PPB is relatively cheap to conventional plant breeding. So we looked at costs in two phases. The first phase was training, and the second phase is practice. So the training costs basically refer to investments of time and resources necessary for farmers to become prepared to do PPB research. So this happens basically through workshops on various themes, including how to plant trials, how to evaluate bean and maize characteristics, how to identify different types of pests and diseases. There's a number of other themes, but those are just some. So the first picture, you can see this happening. Basically on the left, the guy who's cut off is the local agronomist, Marvin, and he's teaching a new CL, a new group of farmers, how to plant a maize trial. The second part we looked at in terms of costs were the practice costs, so the costs of actually doing research. And so in the second photo, you have me being explained by a very experienced CL member. I'll call him a bean breeder. His name is Odir, and he's basically explaining how he set up a bean trial in his community. So this is what happens after training and a bunch of years of work. Basically, the practice costs were referring to the investments of time and resources necessary to plant and maintain trials, to collect data, and in the end, to harvest and collect more data. So in getting at the costs, we're really trying to answer the question, what are farmers doing and how much does it cost? What are farmers doing in order to create new seed varieties? So we did this by visiting communities where farmers are doing research, and we conducted focus groups, but also just through informal interviews, we asked them to tell us their stories. And so they told us their stories, and we wrote them down, and we basically did this in the beans, we did it for one variety called Amilcar, and in maize, we did it for a variety called Capulín Mejorao. And so with their stories, we basically calculated the cost. We took it home and costed everything out. In doing this, we considered the time of farmers, so the value of time invested by farmers. We're talking about the opportunity cost, the value of time invested by agronomists, so that's represented by their salaries, and the value of the materials necessary to do PPB research. So that's the gas necessary to fill up motorcycles, to bring people around, cost of fertilizer, the cost of seed to plant trials, the cost of buying notebooks, pads, and pencils to distribute to farmers so that I can actually do research. So some of the things we found, again, I'm in this right now, but there's a major time commitment necessary on the part of farmers in order to do PPB. We're talking about 336 hours just to go through the training per person, and 628 hours in order to conduct a trial, to complete a trial. That's total hours. So this is a major time commitment, and what has been reported previously has basically valued this time as 0. So what we went out and did is looked at, well, what could the opportunity cost be? So we looked at the local labor wage rate in different communities. It wasn't uniform, there was differences, but it basically is between 67 cents and $1 per hour. So we used this to calculate the cost of training as well as practice. In training, we came to a cost of $190 per CL member, so everyone would have to go through this who's involved in PPB. Again, what was reported previously makes no mention of training. So this sort of assumes that farmers can do PPB research without any training. And in terms of the practice cost, this is the cost to do one trial in the beans. We basically came to $200, whereas what was reported previously for the same type of trial, actually a much bigger trial than ours, was $68. So we can already see what we're going to probably find is that the costs of PPB are much higher than what's been previously reported. So in terms of the benefits, we basically assumed CL participation to be associated with some benefits, and we kind of set out with our survey to figure out what those benefits were. So we created a 16-page survey. It was quite long, took about an hour to complete, and it had questions about socioeconomic characteristics, diet, production, income, and also seed varieties. What seed varieties were actually being used by farmers? So we came home with 280 surveys of maize and bean farmers, and we categorized them into 3 groups, and they're actually from 45 different communities. So in the first group, we have experienced CL members. We have We have experienced CIAL members who are basically people who have been members of the CIAL for more than 4 years. Then we have new CIAL members, so we're talking about people who have been members for 4 years or less. And then we have the non-CIAL farmers. So these are people in the experienced CIAL communities who are maize and bean farmers, but for whatever reason have not joined the CIAL. So we came home with 91 surveys in the first group, 88 in the second group, and 101 surveys in the third group. Our goal was to have 100 in each group, and I've just received word that they will be sending those along, the extra 20. So when we do our analysis, we'll have 100 in each group. All survey participants were randomly selected. So we were provided lists from local health authorities, from FIPA, the local organization, and we also created our own lists. So there were many communities that simply the people had not been written down ever, or at least we couldn't find it. So we asked our farmer facilitators to go out into the field and write down everyone's name. So these were probably our most accurate lists. And we used these lists to randomly select participants, and with our sub-lists, we went into the communities and tried to find these people. This was not always easy. You don't always find who you're looking for. Sometimes you find who you're looking for. They don't want to participate in your survey, fair enough. Sometimes you find people and they haven't planted in the previous period. Or sometimes you find people and they don't know anything about production. It's their husband who knows. So maybe we have to wait, or maybe we have to come back. So we did have a reserve list of randomly selected people, so this didn't hold us back too much. But that was something we ran into. So our expected results and kind of just general expectations are to find that PPB varieties are being used by CIAL members. This is something we just expect to find. Our analysis will show whether this is a benefit or not, but we definitely think that this will happen. In terms of benefits in general, we feel or we expect that long-standing CIAL members, so people who have been in the CIAL for longer than 4 years, are going to be better off than new CIAL members or non-CIAL members. This is what we really expect to find. And when we say better off, we're talking about higher yield levels, higher income, and fewer hungry weeks, the concept that Lauren mentioned. Next steps, got a lot of work to do. Enter, I think of the 280, I have 10 surveys in Excel, so I've got a lot of statistical analysis to. We plan to return to Honduras in January to discuss our findings with the farmers and basically ask for their help explaining whatever we do find out. We also have to translate everything once again, first from Spanish to English, then back to Spanish. So that'll take some time. And we also ultimately hope to produce articles for publication based on quantitative and mixed methods. So I'll pass it over to Sally to sum it up for us.
First thing I can say, what fantastic graduate students that I've had to work with. I think you'll all agree. Absolutely extraordinary. I mean, these are not typical master's theses that are being produced here. I mean, this is absolutely fantastic research. Thank you both so much. It was wonderful. So just to sum up, we know from the findings, and as Lauren mentioned, actually these have been published in World Development, that agricultural research can indeed benefit the most marginal. You have to target it, but it can work. But we have to recognize that the costs are going to be higher than typically have been estimated for this. The indicator identification, as Lauren pointed out very clearly, needs to be participatory. You need to bring local people into the process of establishing what those indicators should be. You can't just go out with a survey instrument, from here and expect local people to respond appropriately. You won't know the questions to ask. You've got to spend time first in the field with local people to know what the questions are that you have to pose to people. We found certainly that doing a survey is necessary, but it's not enough. The survey provided us with that descriptive data that was vital, but we needed to understand the whys. Why were these things happening? We had to sit down with local people. They had to provide those causal pathways for us to understand what was happening in that survey. It would have been easy to go away with assumptions that we made that were incorrect. We needed the participation of local people. The last point, the empowerment of women occurs in unanticipated ways. As Lauren pointed out, when we started out, this was not a program that was specifically designed to empower women. That wasn't what we were about. It occurred. And we were really interested to understand how it had occurred. It occurred specifically because of the combination of the role played by social capital, the role of trust between women in particular, but between men and women in the project itself. The skills that women developed through the project that provided them with confidence. Women lacked tremendous confidence because they weren't engaged in agriculture. They acquired those skills and they became very confident as a consequence. And finally, the reference to safe spaces. The CIAL provided this kind of gender-neutral zone. It wasn't research is something new to local people, and it wasn't something that had been claimed specifically by men. Men and women learned together in this space, and it allowed for women to develop these skills and the confidence in that particular space. So these are really the lessons that we learned from this process. So thank you all very much indeed. So I think we've got time. We've got some time for questions.
We have about half an hour. I'm going to let Sally and the team take control of this session with questions and answers. So thanks again for coming out. We have another speaker series event coming to you on the 22nd of October, I believe, with a co-presentation with the economics department. So for now, we'll just turn it over to question and answer.
Anita.
Yeah, I guess you know this already, but when you do CBA, it's easy to do the cost. I think it's wonderful that you did that with demystify the participatory research. But when you do the benefits, the thing is, how do you monetize? How do you monetize libertad? How do you monetize less stress in household relations? That will be a difficulty. So the argument, I would argue that in some ways it's good to know the cost, but still the benefits are so tremendous. Regarding that cost, is really nothing if you look at the long-term benefits. It's not just the short-term, but the long-term benefits of well-being, greater happiness, less stress.
Yeah, no, I think this point is entirely relevant, and I think one could. I don't want to put it onto the economist to try and answer that question, because that's an almost impossible question to.
We reported on our evaluation of beekeeping project in Vietnam last year, and when you asked, I remember asking this old man, is there any change in how you deal with your wife? He said, oh yeah, because the bees make me so relaxed. I'm so much happier. And because I'm happier, I'm nicer to my family. So my family is actually happier. So how do you, there's a benefit there, how you monetize it,
It's a great question, comment. I don't know how we're going to quantify a lot of the benefits. For example, I was going through a survey today, and we have that question, why did you join the CIAL? And so one of the people said, we joined the CIAL because we like to be organized. We like the feeling of being organized. That's a main benefit. Like these people wanted to organize, but no one pushed them into being organized. So I can't quantify that. And there are a lot of things that we won't be able to quantify. But things we can quantify are yield, income, reduced number of weeks when you don't have enough food. So whatever we can, we will. But we will not be figuring out how to put a price on happiness from this thesis. I can guarantee that. Well, yield is, it's being measured in kilograms per hectare, but we translate it to pounds for the sake of our discussion. I don't really know what you mean by political.
Are you going to be quantifying that through the survey, or are you going out into the field yourself and actually determining the yield increases?
Oh, so what? Yeah, so what we did was, in our 280 surveys, that we already have them here, we did just that. And I conducted 30 surveys, but we had a team of about 15 people working on the rest of them. And yeah, there's a question on that. There's detailed questions on what was your yield. And we did it all based on, 2012, because the cycle hadn't finished for the current season. So it was all about 2012, and basically, how many pounds did you plant? What was your yield? What did you use? Like, what were your production costs through the whole year? How many laborers did you use? All that. And so, yeah, we have a lot of data on that. And I don't know, in terms of political concerns, I mean, we went through all the appropriate channels, and basically everyone said that if you're working with FIPA, you're good.
But I think maybe it's an interesting question in terms of potential bias. It can be more. What you were asking? It can be more accurate for sure to actually measure to plot out a certain area within people's fields and measure that yield each year. And I've worked with a project in another location that has done that, and extensive amounts of work on that. But as we talk about costs associated with projects and development, project has to decide whether those costs are better put into measuring the yield or actually doing the work. And in some cases, it's actually just better to do the work and to ask people. And most farmers are pretty good at knowing how much they planted because the whole life and the life of their family relies on it. So most farmers know how much they planted and how much they harvested, how much they eat. And a big part of the project, the CL project, is actually calculating how much did you harvest, how much does your family need to eat, how much can you sell. So because that's become such an important component of the project, most of the farmers are very aware of those kinds of statistics and can share them easily in a survey. But I think it's a really important question. It can definitely lead to biases, and it's more accurate if you take the time to measure out a plot of the same size and annually compare yields in those plots. Yeah.
That's what she was asking. Okay.
Candice Johnson, Department of Political Science. My question is for Lauren. Lauren, I think on one of the slides, the one you kept flipping back to, I think the last box, was that something like men's perception of women's participation?
It was.
Can you talk about that?
A little bit. So I grouped it together with project histories. So there were just two different qualitative methods that we used to try and understand the results. At one point, we actually that was the very last thing that we did, was those surveys of men's responses. So again, we took the data back, the qualitative data as well, to the field and said, okay, listen, this is what we're hearing. So tell us how you're responding to this. Is this accurate? And in part, that emerged out of a response that we received to submitting an article submission that sort of said, wait a second, we need to hear, if you are emphasizing this kind of back and forth response, we want yet another response from males who are partners to women who are participating. How do they feel about that? Are they angry with their wives when they get home? And so we went back and did yet another set of interviews to try and understand exactly that question, something we missed asking in the first set.
Are you able to present any of those preliminary findings? Or?
Yeah, actually, I wonder even if I included some of those kinds of quotes. So they are included in the article, and I think actually the last quote on this slide is the only one that emerged from those interviews. So one of the benefits of this is we understood some of the lived experience of things like food insecurity or things like gender inequalities and how that impacted people's lives. So these tools were really important for that. And I decided not to present it due to lack of time to read all of these quotes, but the last one in particular is a quote from a man that says, in some moments, I miss that before she was dedicated to the house completely, but I also recognize the responsibility that she has inside the seal, and I feel very proud of her. And so there is this kind of conflicted feeling around women's engagement in the CL. Not all men felt supportive, but a surprising number of men did, in fact. And it might be in part because they're engaged in the CL under the watchful eye of their husbands. This is not removing women from the community and giving them the opportunity to go to university and become educated. I mean, this is sort of something that is done. So it's maybe a limited kind of gender equality that they're achieving, some kind of empowerment that's somewhat limited by their husband's watchful eye. But on the other hand, many women are not allowed to leave the house. Explained that they were afraid to say their own name in public, and I think that's on one of these quotes as well. And so this does represent a significant change. And so we saw this as an opening, a potential opening, one tiny crack in sort of challenging gender inequalities. Yeah.
With some of the social inequalities, how challenging has it been to link cause with effect in terms of the benefit? So for example, with the empowerment of women, is that due to some of the PPP facilitators being women?
I think that's a good question, specifically around PPP.
I mean, around PPP, there aren't any specific women that are doing the PPP work, right?
Well, I mean, there are women CL members who are doing PPP.
No, but in terms of farmer facilitators. Mary does do
Ilda.
Okay.
One.
Yeah, so there are some facilitators that are women, but the women are heavily engaged in doing PPP work and are very active in it. Yeah, so it's certainly something that interests them.
When we see these sort of yield is somewhat easy to sort of say why that might happen. In terms of the social outcomes, these wonderful social outcomes, I'm just asking as an outsider here, is it difficult to try to figure out why that happened? What was the underlying cause?
I think
Very difficult.
the answer is yes. Yeah, it's difficult. And what we argue here is that, in fact, it was the very fact that this was a multiple year endeavor to try and understand some of those pathways. How did these occur? And what we know about how they occurred didn't emerge in the survey at all. It emerged entirely from how people understood the survey and explained how the results emerged in their lives. So once we actually included one very qualitative question about why libertad or decision-making had changed, and we had limited responses from that in the survey, and that gave us something to start with in follow-up project histories and follow-up interviews, follow-up surveys of the men. And those are the kinds of comments we were able to say, okay, so we learned this in the survey. Somebody said this. What does that mean? Do you agree with that? What about you? Do you agree with that? And from that kind of data, we were able to sort of compile some idea of the pathways through which this has occurred. And we said that this occurred through the kind of social capital, which happens simultaneous with confidence building, which happens simultaneously with other factors. It's not a precise path, but it is to say that the project, lessons would be that projects would have to try and align several different factors at the same time. So one isn't enough. And that social capital is critical to it, that confidence building and skills building is critical, and that skills building has to happen within the view of men, so that men can also build their confidence in their wives and maybe allow them a little bit more freedom to engage in things, particularly in a context like Honduras. Less so in, I think, African contexts where women are more engaged in agriculture. They would need different kinds of activities to encourage a kind of empowerment. But in this context where this is totally new for women, it did kind of increase people's confidence in women's capabilities outside of the house or outside of traditional gender roles. So.
So you mentioned that some wealthy farmers left the process. Looking back, were there some lessons in terms of who were the most receptive or the most successful farmers? Are there some traits that they had you could target in the future to go after those farmers?
It almost feels as though you have to go through that initial phase where people join something for the wrong reasons, and then because there's a lot of work involved, they're going to leave, and the ones who really want to learn will stay in. And that's kind of one of the arguments that we also put forward for women. If their project, especially in the African context, we see often that projects are, dominated by men, but when there's a lot of work, there's actually quite a lot of literature on this, the men start to leave, and this is where it provides an opportunity for the women to come in. So it's almost so you have to go through that initial phase, and then you get the people that really are going to benefit, are going to work hard, but it's a long-term process. It has costs, And I think, so many projects are 2 years, 3 years, and they end up with the wrong people in them. And that's the problem. So it really does speak to the long-term nature of development programming. And unfortunately, that's what we don't see.
Sally, this is a question sort of about the project rather than the evaluation. How do the improved seeds that are being developed by the farmer kind of disseminate outward to the community? Do they stay within the CL? Do they get out to the broader community? And I think you said maybe some have been commercialized nationally, so what's that process like?
This is probably the most tricky aspect right now, and Sebastian also has findings on this, is that there's tremendously good seed out there which is very high yielding relative to what farmers would be planting otherwise. But the farmers that are producing seed want a return. I mean, they are the people that have been in long term, and to develop this seed is very time consuming. I mean, one of the Cials actually manages 30 populations of maize, which they use to create their variety. I mean, they have the genetic bases for that variety. Tremendous amount of work. But the farmers that they work with are so poor in the communities that they just, they'll just plant grain as opposed to seed, because for them the risk involved in shelling out the extra money to plant seed is too high for them. And so one of the biggest breaks right now is that of finding markets. Small, either at a national level, small seed providers, or finding some way to subsidize that initial taking on the seed. Because what's happening now, the seed growers themselves provide loans, but they'll only provide loans because their own money to very good credit risks, because they want a return. And so the farmers who are the poorest are not good credit risks, and so they're not getting access to this seed. And so this is kind of the barrier that's currently being faced. Do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, just diffusion is one of the main places or ways diffusion is happening is through these loans that are basically FIPA. FIPA acts as like a centralized place where all the new seed varieties are stored. And so FIPA will loan to CL members at a rate of 2 for 1. So I lend you 20 pounds. When you do your harvest, you give me 40 pounds back. And so that is a main way that varieties are getting out there. Of course, this only works for the CL members. And so if you can talk to us in 3 months, maybe, I think I might have a better answer for you because I'm going through it now.
I'm just wondering, USC is pretty good at dealing with this kind of issue internationally, so maybe there's another dimension of the project or another project.
We've talked about it with them, and I think it's an issue, and other people have pointed to this issue. Rob Tripp wrote a book precisely about 2002, pointing exactly at this as being one of the limitations in seed production. That farmers are so used to, because of the risk, just to planting the grain, because to lower their costs, and it's hard to make that next step to get farmers to plant high quality seed because it's more expensive.
John?
I guess this question's for Sally. You've got the benefit of having what I would call a very mature project. It's had a life of almost 20 years.
Yeah.
And the one thing I wondered about is whether or not some of the changes that you've seen in terms of the social dynamic of the households have had a spillover effect onto the children of some of the people who were early participants and their life courses, and whether or not the change in the environment in that household maybe influences in a positive way their both economic and non-economic well-being as they move out of the house and go through their own life cycle. Have you got any evidence to support that that's actually happening?
Well, what we do know is that CL members, adults, encourage their children to become youth CL members. So there's a kind of a process, and then youth CL members will join the CL when they become adults. So we see this process happening. And actually, one of the comments when we collected the data on men's opinions about their wives' involvements, one of the things that they commented on quite extensively was the fact that, since their wife had become engaged in being a CL member, they were they were encouraging their children to become active in agriculture as well. And so men were very approving of this because now the whole household was engaged in the process. And so I think there is this spillover effect into sort of younger generations. One of the biggest tendencies in, well, not just in Honduras, throughout the developing countries, developing world, is people leaving the countryside to go to work in the cities, of course. And that is still happening. I mean, there's only so much land to go round. And so there is this, people still leave and go and work in Honduras in the maquiladoras, and that happens. But what you do see is a strong interest in the children of CIAL members in agriculture.
We also, maybe related to that, the survey also found that there's an increased interest in education, and particularly education for children as a result of being a member of the CIAL. In part because CIAL members start to realize how important it is that they can record things like the amount of grain that they're consuming each year, or how important it is that they can read and write, so they can sign their name when they join a new organization, those kinds of things. So we have a lot of qualitative as well as some quantitative data showing exactly that kind of movement towards education. I don't know whether that education benefits those children in their agricultural practices as they move forward, maybe in recording things, or maybe as they move to urban areas to get better jobs. But that may be another spillover to the next generation.
So one of the objectives here, maybe the main objective, was to reduce hunger during the dry season, which, as you know, is a common problem around the world. So was this primarily achieved just by increasing yields during the growing season, or were there other activities that you undertook in the dry season?
There was more food to last, but it was also the calculation of how much food was required, because people typically had, in the past, and Anita found this out in her master's thesis, which was the first thesis to be conducted in the area, that people were typically indebted to other people, and they had to sell directly after the harvest at a low price. And so they never got out of that spiral of debt. So one of the things that the CIAL was able to do was to break that spiral. And then people started saying, okay, now we can plan for the whole year, because now we don't have to sell directly. But that also implies that they have to have storage containers, post-harvest storage. So there's a whole series of things that go with getting rid of the hungry season. So it's not, you're right, it's not just yield. I mean, there are a number of different factors.
And did you try to introduce any agricultural activities during the dry season? I mean not raising beans, but something else.
Agroforestry plots, plantains and things like that around the house. I mean, these are some of the things that people do. It's not that long, the dry season in Honduras. It's and particularly with climate change, it often rains sort of almost right the way through. I mean, there used to be a very distinctive dry period, and there seems to be that not to be the case. You can, often it continues to rain right the way through now.
From what I can tell about the Hungry Weeks, basically most people, they're just, whether they can afford it or not, they're buying beans and maize when they don't have enough. So from what I can tell, there's no, and that as far as I know, that's not a FIPA objective to target new activities for the Hungry Weeks. I think people mainly, they either buy or they get loans from people or they eat other things. So.
Again, sort of maybe a spillover benefit people talk about is having, I now know my neighbors, might be in one of these quotes that are here, but if not, now I now know my neighbors so I can go and ask them for things when I need it. Whereas before I felt shy to ask them for things. There was real sort of a sense of competition between people in villages rather than a sense of collaboration. But these farmers are all now working together. Women in particular know their neighbors a lot better. They've shared in resources like childcare while they're working in the fields. And so there's sometimes saying, I can actually just go next door. They've got maize, and I can get it if I really need it. And so there is a little bit of that happening. But again, that wasn't purposeful on the part of the project specifically. But whether they're growing vegetable plots or anything during the dry season, not specifically.
I don't know.
No, micro-irrigation is a problem because then it takes water away from other people. So that's something of a conflictual kind of issue.
My question relates to spillovers, but in the other direction. So changes over the past 20 years that you've seen in Honduras. I know just in our informal conversations about your experiences in the evaluation, logistics of the evaluation of changes in Honduras, crime, forestry, the relative autonomy of this project from those forces or factors, or in that general area, like how has that changed, or those changes, series of changes in Honduras borne upon the project and the research process?
Well, I think everybody probably aware here that the security in Honduras is pretty perilous now. I mean, it wasn't at the outset of the project in '93. Honduras was sort of coming out of a period of sort of military repression, and becoming, situated as it is on the main drug pathway between Colombia and North America. A very weak government. Crime is rampant. It has one of the highest murder rates, I think, outside of a war zone. Certainly certain cities do. It's very, very violent. And so conducting research there is not as straightforward now as it was even when Lauren was doing it in 2003. One has to be careful.
Yeah.
You can't just kind of walk around as a grad student between villages. It's not safe, whereas it really was when Lauren was there. So it certainly affects one's ability to collect data. It affects the project's ability. It affects the project's ability to hire women to work with farmers because of the security threat that women face because of the increased violence. So yes, it makes it much more difficult.
Another technical question. I can remember driving through Honduras and being surprised at sort of the hill agriculture with absolutely no terracing of any sort at all. And I noticed in the pictures that I saw here, basically, people were planting on the hill. So is there any of that sort of physical rearrangement of the infrastructure to terrace and flat field, better water retention and so on?
No, people use live barriers, which over time lead to a sense of terraces, but there are very few physical, terraces that you might see what you do see in Southeast Asia, for example. Yeah.
I think people explained actually often that they risk flooding in those cases, that they're actually better off not to terrace. But the project has had a significant impact on people planting counter the slope as opposed to planting down the slope.
Yeah.
So that has had a huge impact on, and like Sally said, sometimes it kind of looks like terraces. Once the soil erosion takes place and hits those live barriers, you get a bit of a sense of a terrace, but yeah.
Any last questions?
Warren.
This is for Lauren. So in the participatory analysis of the survey data, you're showing farmers' quantitative results. What was kind of the reaction to that and the response to that? And was there any time where you were showing like an association between two variables and farmers said that doesn't actually exist? Your stats don't actually mirror what we've experienced.
For sure, for some people. Some women would say, well, I don't have more chickens. I want more chickens. Who has more chickens in this room? Yeah, for sure. And we say, no, this is an average. Some people have more chickens. In fact, some more people than people over here. So yeah, for sure, people refuted some of the results. I mean, frequently refuted the results, especially on their individual basis. And there was a real lack of understanding among some people of the concept of average. It was hard to communicate. We tried to use photographs in all those cases. So we presented the bar charts, but we also took a picture of a cow and 5 chickens because sale members had an average of 5 more chickens than non and only 1 more cow than non. So we could try to explain. So if Don Chicho over here has 5 more cows and you have none, and we're meeting someplace in between, we might say in this village people have about 3. That's about an average. So we spent a lot of time explaining those concepts and what the graphs meant and what the differences meant. Some of the CL members themselves are very familiar with graphs. They use them all the time in their own presentations. They could easily comprehend them. They really liked seeing that kind of data. But a lot of the community members who weren't involved in the survey but came out to hear about the survey results and really appreciated that process, thanked us a lot for being the first people to come back with the survey to actually show them what's being done with it. They didn't understand entirely the results, but they appreciated the opportunity to discuss it. And sometimes we'd say, okay, nobody in this community feels they have more chickens. So what's happening? Let's see what happens in the 10 communities. Across 10 communities, are we right with this average? Are we not? Were people exaggerating the number of chickens? And usually things kind of worked out. In the end, we were sort of, our statistics weren't off, but they were off for some individuals, yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you. Sebastian, Lauren, and Sally for coming.